Next, on challenges and countermeasures of food production under climate change, we'd like to have Chief Economist of USDA, Dr. Seth Meyer, address us and give us a presentation. Thank you.
Please take it away if you're ready, please.
It's my pleasure to be here today. And this is actually a bit of a difficult presentation for me as I will be followed by experts which talk to you about the potential outcomes of climate change in the future. So it's really my pleasure to be here and set the stage a little bit, to tell you a little bit about where we've been, a little bit about U.S. policy, to try to get us to a better place as we observe what may be potential outcomes in the future. In listening to our two previous speakers, I was reminded of a story we tell at home at Christmas time. There is a gentleman who lives a bad life, and he is visited by 3 ghosts. And the first ghost tells him the things that he has done bad in the past. And the second ghost comes and tells him the bad things he is doing in the present. And finally, the ghost of the future comes and tells him, if you do not do better things, this is what your future looks like. This is what your future could be. And the story ends with him changing and living a better life. So I think it is somewhat appropriate here that we talk about what are the potential risks of not doing something different. Okay? So when I will tell you a little bit about how I've seen the U.S. ag sector and the global ag sector evolve in the past, some of what we are observing today, but then again, some of the policies we are trying to put in place in the U.S. or how we think about policy that maybe will help move us off some of the negative paths that my colleagues will talk about in the future. Okay? So with that, let's talk a little bit, the ghost of the past. Let's talk about a little bit about what we've observed in the past here. And I think it's important to remember that, overall, as we've seen in the last in the 20th century, that productivity has replaced natural resources. So instead of extensification, we have gone to intensification in the ag sector. We have seen agricultural commodity prices fall in real terms, and agricultural productivity has actually exceeded global population. So as far as the past goes, we have been quite productive. We have improved the agricultural productivity around the world. We have brought down commodity prices over time. And I should note here that while my hosts have been very kind in calling me an expert, USDA is a big place. So I am drawing on much of the expertise across the Department of Agriculture, where we look at this from many different perspectives. So here, I think this is an important one to remember, that we have been quite productive in applying technology and improving output over the last century. It has been a real success. And when we think about where some of those successes have come from in the past, we can look through this list and we can observe things which have improved agricultural productivity over the last 100 years. Obviously, one you are very familiar with, green revolution in terms of food grain production in developing countries, really improving yields. When I visit India, Norman Borlaug is seen as an icon, a hero for the productivity and the benefits that he had brought to the agricultural sector. You can see other evolutions in livestock, in agricultural policy decoupling in high-income countries, adding flexibility into the marketplace, a market-based solution in places like the United States, which enhanced productivity. And even things like geopolitical shifts, such as the breakup of the Soviet Union. I will remind you that at one point the Soviet Union was a net wheat importer. Russia now represents 25% of global agricultural trade. So there are geopolitical shifts which are absolutely important when we think about the formation of productivity. And let's talk a little bit more about where that productivity comes from. So this is a concept here where we're really differentiating between more input use So is it more volumes of fertilizer? Is it more volumes of land? Or is it that the outcomes, the efficiencies of those inputs are improving? And one of the ways we've been able to achieve that increasing productivity has been through increases in total factor productivity. Think about it this way. I may not increase the number of workers I have, but if they are more skilled, I get more output per unit. Okay, so this is one of the ways where we can also minimize the environmental impact if we can produce more without increasing overall factor use. And thus far, for several decades, we have been successful in achieving increased productivity from the inputs that we have. Now, it is notable that it has recently slowed, and we can debate, are there climate impacts? Are there falling resources and investments in public research into agricultural productivity? But you can also divide this up into a couple different places. So in the US, on the right, you'll see we are not using more land. We are not using more inputs. We are deriving more output from the same units of land. In the United States, our land base is not changing. In other places in the world, they are seeing both increased efficiency, increased output per unit, but they are also bringing more land into production. And that has been a concern for us from an environmental standpoint, where that land is coming from and what the source of that land is. But it has been a contributor to increased productivity, increased production over the last few decades. And you can see that very distinctly when I show you a graph that talks about the difference between the northern hemisphere countries and the southern hemisphere countries. You can see that land constraint pretty clearly where we derive our productivity gains from increasing the efficiency use of our inputs. And in the southern hemisphere, they're doing it both from bringing more inputs into production, more land, and the productivity of those inputs also improving. Okay? But again, both showing perhaps moderating growth in that productivity, that rate of that productivity as we go forward. But I think that this is a story that is important for us to think about how we may maintain this in the future to address the ghost of Christmas future, for a lack of a better way to put it. Okay? So thus far, we have been able to reduce the environmental impact, the greenhouse gas emissions per unit of output, because we have held those inputs fairly stable while increasing the productivity of those inputs. So per unit, our input total use may remain fairly flat, but per unit, it is declined because of those productivity increases. If we are to achieve a better path in the future, we must continue to produce more from the same or fewer inputs in order to get ourselves onto a better path. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the challenges. And again, I will set up some of the speakers that we have in the coming sessions here, just to remind you some of the things that we need to concern ourselves with when we think about policy or actions in the future that will be important. Clearly, population. For some countries, we have seen population peak and even start to decline, but there are parts of the world, specifically sub-Saharan Africa, where population is expected to rise rapidly, or continue to rise. Maybe not as rapidly as it has, but continue to rise. And problematically, this is also one of the locations in the world where the highest prevalence of food insecurity exists today. So we're talking about population growth in an area with already significant food insecurity. But when we go forward, it is not just population. It is population and income growth that will be part of the issue as well, too. When people's incomes rise, they demand better, perhaps more food in some instances, better food, more protein in their diet. So we have to deal with both increasing population as well as increasing incomes as we go forward. So you can see here regionally, places like Africa seeing both large population increases and per capita consumption increases, which contribute to increased need in the region. So a combination of rising incomes and rising populations. And even then, we can say food gaps still remain even at those increased levels. So as we look forward, we're trying to provide more and address those people's demand needs, but perhaps again, there will still be folks who may have calorie limited or diet limits, so this isn't a perfect solution either. So this will put pressure on land, and this graph is a little bit of a different way to show this, which it basically translates population into land use needs. So we're going to need some additional land in order to service the needs of people in different regions. So when you look at this, clearly this just translates population needs in sub-Saharan Africa into additional land need based upon those population and income increases. And none of this yet includes the risks of climate change either in these projections from my colleagues at ERS. And it's going to be a combination of different factors as well too when we think about land use needs, those land use needs for things like oil seeds and coarse grains, and less so for things like sugar and rice, but land use needs increasing to satisfy increased needs for coarse grains and oil seeds over time. And remember that as folks' incomes rise, they want more protein and more diversity in their diet. So we will need to provide grains to feed animals as well too, in order for people to have the protein in their diets that they desire. So you will be producing more calories than will be consumed by humans as that demand increases as well too. So we need to make sure we understand the transformation of diets that will be desired as people's incomes improve. And as we hear from the speakers who are subsequent, they will talk about different scenarios that get us to different endpoints based upon different assumptions and different risks. And here we can start to talk about things like slower population or larger population will obviously result in either a need to improve crop yields or increase area in the absence, again, of climate change. This just begins to tell you how population scenario differences will lead to more or less land pressure. And at the same time, productivity growth. We talked about productivity growth being a source of a very positive source in terms of productivity, agricultural production over the last several decades. But again, it has slowed recently. What does the future look like? What do we need the future to be in order to enhance the sustainability of production in the future? If we have a low productive future, whether that's low productivity through climate change or underinvestment in agricultural research, that puts more pressure on land, it results in higher commodity prices, and it puts more people at risk of food insecurity. And again, I think, I know I said this, but I am emphasizing it again, that diets change when people's incomes change. And we have been fortunate to be able to access things like meat and protein consumption. Other places in the world would like to do the same. And with that comes its own pressure in terms of supplying the feed for those animals going forward. Okay, so you can think here, and it's not just meat production, it's things like milk and ruminant animals, obviously, but this is another source of a need to increase production simply to support things like dairy animals around the world. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about Christmas the current Christmas. We have seen rising temperatures around the world. Global average temperatures rising. We can pick out numerous indicators where we can see that we are seeing pressure today on factors which contribute to agricultural production. We can see sea surface temperatures, land surface temperatures, changes in sea level, etc. We can see those indicators happening today, and they are early warnings. But thus far in the U.S., for instance, we perhaps don't observe obvious negative effects today, right now, about climate change. That doesn't mean that there isn't an inflection point in the future. And so I think that that's one of the things that we must start to consider, is that thus far we have adapted well. I think it becomes increasingly difficult to adapt over time. And so when we look at this, you have a corn yield growth in the United States, which seems very stable, despite the fact that growing conditions have been pretty variable the last several years, except yields have not varied. Part of that is our research and development on crop yields, which add stability. But how much longer can you maintain that is a question that we think about in the future. Is there an inflection point out there that makes it increasingly difficult? We've had success so far. Can we maintain that success? Or are we seeing it masked in other ways? Because even in our own projections of the impacts of climate change, we can see negative impacts on productivity, yield changes, area production impacts, price changes, which cause less affordability for consumers. And one of the difficulties here is also, as this is occurring, we expect land. Part of this, the discussion is, well, will we not just produce crops in different regions? Will we just not move crops? Or we are not observing yield impacts today. And so, again, land will shift, but even that is not without consequences. In the United States, for instance, we have seen strong growth in corn and soybean production as it has moved to areas which had typically not been very suitable to corn and soybean production. Part of this may be a weather issue, and part of it's a technological advance where corn and soybeans become more suited to these regions. They become more productive than the crop which exists there, so the crops are shifting. But this is not without consequences either. Here I'm showing you, this is a busy graph, but here is where our corn production occurs in the United States, and each one of those little dots is also a sales point in the U.S. for that grain. The whole system in the U.S. as it currently stands now is structured for where the crop is produced now. My only point being is that we have a system which is based in where the crops are produced now. Right? So infrastructure, if you can't simply pick up and move crops to a completely new area of the country, you've got infrastructure which has to exist to satisfy that crop. And thus far, we haven't had a problem. But again, I think changes in the climate thus far are masking some of the issues with respect to climate change in the United States. So here are some of the temperatures, observed temperatures in the last several decades compared to earlier periods. And you can see much higher temperatures. But thus far, those much higher temperatures exist outside of the main production areas of the United States. The biggest temperature increases occur outside those areas. And the summer temperatures in particular have not shown large increases over time. This is fortunate, obviously, because those are critical growing areas in the United States. But what you do see is over winters that the winters remain warmer. That we do not get as many cold temperatures in the winter. But there are negative aspects of having warmer overwinter temperatures as well, too. And when you think about frost-free days over periods of the United States, this means you have more prevalence, more potential for pests and diseases overwintering, and you have more potential for negative impacts from that ability to overwinter. And so while we have not observed temperature impacts perhaps on yield to the extent we have seen overall temperatures changes, it does not mean that we do not face risks. And I think we can say the same for moisture as well too. Thus far, climate change has not had a negative effect on some of our primary row crop growing areas. But again, I think as we think about the future, there is an inflection point out there someplace. When we think about corn production in the United States, 3 days of 35-degree Celsius temperatures are very bad for corn. At what point do we hit enough of those 3 days periods in a row where we start to have the inability to adapt. Okay, so I've talked to you a little bit about kind of where we are at, where I see things at today, but let's talk a little bit about USDA's view or USDA's thoughts about how to put policy in place that might help us get onto a different path for climate change. So I think that we can both talk about agriculture as an emitter, so that's on the left, but we can also talk about agriculture as a sink, okay? So we have to have policies which do two things, both enhance our ability to be a sink and minimize the emissions on the left-hand side. So we want to reduce our emissions on the left and increase our sinks on the right. So we think that both agriculture clearly is an emitter, but we also think at USDA it can be a contributor to the solution as well too, and that is very important for us. We need to have our agricultural partners be a contributor to the solution. And so I think one of the things that we at least need to consider is public research as well too. And I'll talk about a few different things, but I also want to talk here about the global north and the global south in terms of agricultural research and development and private research as well too. So as we see public research fall off, we've also seen total factor productivity growth ease as well too. So I think there continues to remain a role for public research, and clearly contributions by private research are important as well too. So I think one of the things that we need to consider here is research in order to continue to increase productivity. So when we think about some of the principles about adaptation in ag for the USDA, really voluntary and incentive, and I'm going to talk about this very much, we're the Department of Agriculture, so this is very much about how to engage the agricultural production sector in being a contributor to a better path for climate going forward. So we emphasize things like voluntary and incentive-based actions and policies to get producers to participate in the solution, to create market linkages from the producer through to the retailer so that the farmers will benefit from this need to improve the carbon intensity of the supply chain. Okay? So I think this is very important. It is perhaps a different philosophy in the US than I might compare to our European colleagues. Okay? I think we have three challenges going forward. We need to produce our agricultural goods in a sustainable way. We need to do it in a way that creates safe and affordable food. And we also have to have farmers to make a living being able to do it. Okay, we have to accomplish all three. You can't simply take an approach that perhaps my European colleagues would say, no, we're going to put a regulatory burden on the sector and simply reduce herbicide use in order to improve sustainability. That is not sustainable. Farmers can't make a living, food prices rise. We need to have activities which can do all three. And for us, the application of technology and the participation of producers in order to create market-based solutions to improve climate is absolutely important. We also think that this is important to link by linking producers through the supply chain and having producers benefit from an income stream. So if consumers or the retailers to consumers like Walmart demand improvements in their supply chain, producers should benefit from this, right? And it creates a separate income stream different than the pure commodity. If they are able to sell environmental services, that is a different income stream than the income stream from the pure commodity sale. So again, market-based solutions more sustainable for the producer. The producer has an incentive to do this, has an incentive to participate, making it more sustainable. And again, I think it is important, it needs to meet the needs of producers. It needs to meet their producers, the needs of them as working lands. These are their livelihoods. These are their businesses. So these policies need to reflect these producers, these farmers' business, their land. This is the land from which they derive their living. They want to be good stewards of this land. we need to provide policies that properly incentivize them to take actions and to supply environmental services. And finally, as an economist, I always got to make my pitch for data. I always have to make my pitch for data in this regard as well, too. One of the things that we value at USDA is information. We value information quite highly. We are increasingly putting policies in place in the United States, which I would call pay for performance. Pay for performance. If we want producers to be able to generate income from lower carbon intensity crops, they have to be able to understand how their practices affect their carbon intensity. We have policies being put in place in the United States that say tax benefits improve as carbon intensity improves. In order to do that, you have to be able to measure it. There is nothing that makes measurement more critical than putting money on the line. I think you will all understand that. When you pay per pound for something, the scale better be quite accurate. And so from a USDA standpoint, from an economist standpoint, I think it is increasingly important for us to both have a broad agreement, not just in the United States, but across other countries as to what the science says about our ability to reduce carbon, have good agreements on that, and so that we can have better coordinated policy around the world in order to actually achieve our goals. And I got the signal that I should wrap up. So I will stop with this slide and tell you, I do think that in the U.S. we are quite interested, as we hear the different potential impacts, of putting policies in place where we can achieve all three goals. A sustainable production pattern, to do so in a way that is safe and affordable for consumers, and also, in order to be truly sustainable, producers have to be able to make a living doing it. They have to be able to make a future living doing it. So policies to address climate change have to address all three of these policy pillars. And with that, I thank you for the opportunity to speak to you all.
Dr. Meyer, thank you very much, and sorry for the quick wrapping up. Sorry about that.